Hey everyone, in this video we're going to do something a little bit different. I want to talk about the Exiles and Partisans deck, and this is in celebration of the fact that the Root Digital app is finally getting the Exiles and Partisans deck on the mobile and Steam platforms, and I'm really excited about that. And we're just going to talk about my 10 favorite cards in this deck. Not necessarily the most powerful, but the ones I think are the most interesting and that I'm really looking forward to exploring in more depth. And so some of them are going to be cards that might not be as universally practical, we'll just put it that way, but I'm nonetheless really excited to see all of the different implications of them and the way that they're used. And before we get into the 10 favorite cards of the Exiles and Partisans deck, we're just going to do a little sort of farewell send-off to my favorite card in the base deck, which is Tax Collector. I think that Tax Collector is the card that probably has the greatest potential to be in the Exiles and Partisans deck because of its open timing window and that trade of a warrior for card. It's a really good deal, but the trick is knowing exactly when to use this card is really cool because let's say as the Eerie, I could have my warriors in the perfect number in a clearing to rule it and then place my roost. And then now I don't need to rule it anymore. I can just remove the warrior to get the benefit and then have it be really synergizing well with the charismatic leader, or for the Woodland Alliance, if there's a warrior I sent into another clearing to protect a token, and now I don't need that token so well defended anymore, I could just remove that warrior to get a free card. So I really like this card. It's the only one I kind of wish were in the Exiles and Partisans deck, but alas, I'd rather have the Exiles and Partisans deck. So let's get right into it. Number 10 is going to be Informants. Informants is a card that we don't actually see crafted very often. Part of that is because of its very high crafting cost of 2 foxes. And not only that, it's a high cost because the way that works is instead of drawing your evening cards, you would then take an ambush out of the discard pile. So sometimes if you would be crafting or drawing 3 cards in the evening, you'd have to forego all 3 of those cards that you would draw, potentially items or really nice cards you want, to then take an ambush out of the discard. But the reason that I like this card from a design standpoint is the same reason that I kind of don't like scouting parties that much. And that's because ambushes are such an important part of Root. They keep the suspense and they force you to think on your toes and always take into account the possibility that the battle is just going to be a disaster. And then once all the ambushes are in the discard, at least for that suit, you can totally rule them out and make all of your plays very confidently because there's no chance of failure. And I like that chance of failure. I like that players have to take risks when they take battles because things can go poorly if they get ambushed. And Informants basically allows those used ambush cards to cycle back into circulation and maintain that interesting dynamic. A lot of the time we won't see this card being used, but I'm very excited that the Lord of the Hundreds, which is going to be not on digital for a while probably, but the Lord of the Hundreds is a faction that really likes this card because they're almost always drawing just 1 card anyway. So that's my number 10, Informants. My number 9 favorite card is Tunnels. I know what you're thinking. Wait, Tunnels? This is such a niche and probably not that useful card. And you're right, Tunnels isn't the most practical, especially even within the bunny suit, but just the possibilities are really exciting because I want to be able to see what it feels like to have all my crafting pieces be connected. I can imagine all these scenarios where the Marquise de Cats get their clearings split in 2 by some invading army, but if they have crafting pieces, workshops, on either side, and then they craft tunnels, well now they've basically united all of their clearings and all their wood can pass freely between them because they're all technically united. And let's say the Woodland Alliance spreads Sympathy and Birdsong, and then in daylight crafts this card, and then in evening they could move a warrior right from their base all the way over through enemy lines to defend their Sympathy token that they just placed that turn. So all kinds of really cool ideas that I can come up with Tunnels, and I'm probably leaving a lot out, so just very excited to see all the possibilities with Tunnels. Next up is Saboteurs. Saboteurs might not be the most exciting card because it doesn't really give you any kind of benefit. It doesn't allow you to do anything special. All it does is it destroys somebody else's crafted improvement. But there are two little dynamics that aren't immediately obvious, and they're why I like to craft saboteurs as quickly as possible, provided I don't need the bird card. One is that it's setting myself up for a future craft. So let's say I craft something amazing, like coffin makers. I would always be worried of somebody else's saboteurs destroying my coffin makers. But if I craft saboteurs early, and then later get coffin makers or something amazing, then saboteurs can act as a shield, because if somebody tries to craft saboteurs to take away my coffin maker, I can preemptively destroy their saboteurs, thus protecting my coffin makers. And the other reason is the psychological effect that a crafted saboteurs has. Now, because I've shown that I can immediately destroy anyone else's improvement, they're way less likely to craft their amazing effects like Murine Broker, Coffin Makers, or False Orders. So just having it in my zone creates this sort of Sword of Damocles effect where, okay, you can craft something, but I'm going to destroy it. And thus they might never actually end up crafting those really awesome cards. And thus, even if I never use the saboteurs, it still actively did something because it was posturing towards the enemies. So I really like having saboteurs. And I do think that it's a vital card for this deck to function, because having them cycling through the deck means that the designers were able to make really cool, powerful cards that are scary and require some kind of counterspell. So saboteurs is number 8. Well, number 7 is boat builders. There's an old saying that he who rules the seas rules the world. And I do think that that's possibly true depending on the map. So looking at the winter map, for example, we're all familiar with this central river. It can be really hard to navigate the map, but having boat builders and just having access to this one river clearing can really open up your game. The same goes on the lake map or even the mountain map. And I just love the fact that having this card crafted means that I'm forced to look at the entirety of the map in a whole different way, and I could potentially spread my sympathy tokens or connect my wood if I'm the cats. And I just love the idea that the waterways are now an avenue of movement for me, and it's exclusive to me, and the other factions don't get that benefit, unless of course it's the river folk. So boat builders, really like it. The next one is Charm Offensive. Every faction really cares about card wealth, but you have to ask yourself, how much is an extra card every turn worth? Am I giving too many points to that opponent? Which opponent should I choose to give a free victory point just so that I can draw an extra card? Well, that depends on a lot of different factors. One is, which faction are we talking about? Is it the Vagabond or is it the Corvids? 2 is, where are they on the victory point track? Are they way in last place or are they in first place? And most importantly, to know whom you should give this point to, you need to be able to assess all the other players and all the other factions to know who is going to benefit the most or least. And so using Charm Offensive very effectively requires being a really clever root player, and I like that it rewards you in that way. I've played so many games where I've had Charm Offensive, used it every turn, and just gave it to the player or players who didn't end up winning, and of course that meant that those points were meaningless for them because it didn't help them win. But those 3, 4, 6 cards that I got from Charm Offensive ended up probably carrying me to the finish. So I love Charm Offensive, but it can definitely be a backfiring card if you end up giving too many points to the player who ultimately wins, obviously. So it's a risk you have to take. Love it. Charm Offensive. Next up is Eerie Emigre. This is the only card in any of the root decks that is actively mandatory. You must take the move if you're able to, and then you must battle in that clearing if you're able to. So because you're being forced to take actions, it actually creates a liability for you. But I love that about different aspects of root. This word liability is so cool because you have to think about all of your actions every turn very carefully, accounting for the fact that next turn you're going to have to take some actions that you may or may not want to take. But the reward for managing this liability is 2 free actions every turn, and that can be huge. The player who has Eerie Emigre, if they are clever and they're able to mitigate that liability and capitalize on these extra actions, that player can be extremely scary if they have this card. It's one that I don't craft often enough just because it's a bird card and it costs 2 foxes, so that's a little bit of a high cost, but I'm really excited to see it crafted more through the digital app because I just am going to be able to play a lot more games. So, Eerie Emigre. Very excited to see the potential. Next one is Mouse, Rabbit, and Fox Partisans. They're all the same for this purpose. And unsurprisingly, the eponymous Partisans cards really represent the deck well, in my opinion. And that's because they're cards that won't initially seem very useful. You're spending 3 cards potentially from your hand in order to deal 1 extra hit. Isn't that not a very good value? Well, maybe if you're only going to use it that one time. But a clever player who plans out their turn and knows the value of their hand is going to be able to make devastating effects with these partisan cards, because if someone attacks you and you decide this is a turn that I'm going to be battling a lot, I can forego my hand, throw away any cards that don't match the suit, and then when it comes back around to my turn, I can take repeated battles and deal an extra hit every time, knowing that I've already spent the cost of the card, because most factions don't draw any more cards until the end of their turn. So the fact that you can use it as attacker or defender and multiple times, as long as you've already discarded the card, or the cards, then you can really be a powerhouse with the partisan cards, and I find them spectacular for that. A really clever player, again, will be very well rewarded by having partisan cards. Next up is Propaganda Bureau. This one I used to underrate, and I think a lot of newer players might as well, but the more you use it, the more you realize how strong it is. The reason I underrated it is because it's kind of the opposite of Tax Collectors, which is you lose a warrior, gain a card. This is gain a card, or lose a card, gain a warrior. Well, that sounds like a bad trade a lot of the time, but think about it this way. It can allow you to thin out your enemy lines because you're also removing an enemy's warrior. You can use it to break martial law. You can use it to regain rule of a clearing by just adding one of your own and taking one of theirs. You can thin their defenses before you battle. There are all kinds of very useful applications for Propaganda Bureau. You could have one of your warriors recruited all the way in the back line, far away from where your normal recruitment points are, and put it in behind enemy territories. And all of those different utilities are free of actions. You don't spend any actions to use this card. You're just spending a card. So knowing when to use Propaganda Bureau can again be really rewarding for a clever player. Okay. The next one in my top 10 is False Orders. False Orders is a lot of people's favorite card in this deck, and because of that, I couldn't have it be my favorite card as well. I do really like it. I think it's probably the spiciest card in this whole deck, and if you've been the victim of a False Orders, you know that its effect can be almost as devastating as a favor card from the base deck. However, unlike a favor card that can usually just mean your game is over, a False Orders card is almost always telegraphed in advance, so someone would have to craft it, and they would wait a full turn before they can use it, unless you're the Corvids. And that gives you a turn to kind of regroup and plan for it being used on you, and so it's not really that bad as long as you've planned for it to happen to you. But also, I just love crafting False Orders because it really shakes up the game. Everyone has to be very aware that it could be used on them, and it forces them to play differently than they would otherwise. They have to play very defensively. They have to have 6 warriors in a clearing, because at any moment you could make that number immediately 3. So I just really like having False Orders. It's a great threat, and similar to the Saboteurs cards, sometimes the threat can be more powerful than the execution. And the last thing I love about False Orders is being able to move enemy warriors on your turn. It can just create all these very interesting rules, quirks, and interactions, and if you've seen any of my shorts, you know I love quirky rules, things, and root. So False Orders, my number 2 favorite card in Exiles and Partisans. So what is my number 1 favorite card in all of Exiles and Partisans? Drum roll, please. It's League of Adventurous Mice. That's right. This unassuming little card is my favorite card in this deck, and I'll tell you why. At first, kind of like a lot of other Exiles and Partisan cards, it might seem very expensive to use. You have to have a crafted item in your items box, and then you have to exhaust it the one time, meaning you can probably only get 2, 3, or if you're lucky, 4 uses out of this card. So unlike Cobbler and Commandborn that can be used every turn at no cost once you craft it, you have much more limited utility of this card. So why do I think it's way better than either Cobbler or Commandborn? Well, partly it's that you could use either a move or a battle, unlike either the cards that force you to only battle or only move. But the real thing is how open the timing window is. Not at the start of daylight, not at the start of evening, it's once in daylight. So a very clever opponent or a very clever player could use the card at any point in their daylight to really synergize with the engine that they've built. So for example, the Eerie could take all their moves, battle down an opponent, and then use League of Adventurous Mice to move past the clearing that they didn't rule, and then now they rule a whole other clearing. Or if they really need one more battle in order to not turmoil, they could use their item and do it. And there's so many different utilities with this card, and like a lot of these other cards, it rewards you much more for using the abilities in a creative and clever way that I don't think the base deck does as well. So all of these cards, all my favorite cards in Exiles and Partisans, really do reward the skill development and the utility knowledge of all the players. And that's why I do think that Exiles and Partisans is the perfect competitive deck, and I'm super excited to have it coming to the digital app on May 3rd. So I will see you guys next time.